Okay, so it is day 150. That's 150 days since this war began in Ukraine. Day 150, here's what's going on the ground. In the last 48 hours, heavy fighting has been taking place as Ukrainian forces have continued their offensive against Russian forces in Kherson Oblast, west of the river Dnipro. So the Ukrainians are starting to press the fight to the enemy. Here's Reuters talking about Ukraine strikes a bridge used for Russian supplies. So they're destroying this bridge or trying to destroy this bridge so that the Russians can't resupply very easily and they'll have a harder time being able to fight. Meanwhile, the Russians are this is 13 Russian missiles hit central Ukraine. So the Russians are still hitting various cities with missiles. 9 Ukrainian servicemen were wounded and one dead. 2 guards at an electrical substation. Heavy fighting taking place in the last 48 hours. There's another article here. Russia fires missiles at Odessa. Now, if you're paying attention at all, Odessa, that was the port from which grain was supposed to be sent, and we just signed a deal yesterday. Barely 12 hours after Moscow signed a deal with Ukraine to allow monitored grain exports to Ukraine's southern ports, Russia targeted Ukraine's main port of Odessa. Like, what? The enemy attacked Odessa sea trade port with Caliber cruise missiles, Ukraine's operational command South wrote. The British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss called it appalling and completely unwarranted. Again, you just signed an agreement that you were going to allow these commercial ships to come out with grain, and now you're shelling less than 12 hours later. Restoring grain shipments from their reopened ports would have brought 5 million tons a month of grain. And the U.S. said this is outrageous. The U.S. ambassador, Russia strikes the port city of Odessa less than 24 hours after signing an agreement to allow shipments of agricultural grain. Okay, so, yesterday I was just talking about can you trust them or can't you? The grain shipment agreement with Russia, yeah, you can't really trust it. And I got this wrong, right? I was saying this yesterday. Russia is, and this is why this article is important. Russia is creating a new pole of influence. That's what they're trying to do with Africa, with the foodstuffs. This is why, I keep talking about, is it worth the paper it's printed on? I think the answer is yes. And it's surprising, but I think the answer is yes because. Now, I got it wrong. And I got it wrong because I was thinking like a rational Westerner, right? Like I'm thinking, hey, Russia really wants to create these agreements. Russia doesn't care about the agreements. It's not worth the paper it's printed on. And so I stand corrected. Grain shipment with agreement, not worth the paper it's printed on. The U.S. accuses Russia of deepening the global food crisis. And just after raising hope, in a statement posted on Twitter, Anthony Blinken said that the United States strongly condemns Russia's attack on the port city of Odessa today. The Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, unequivocally condemns the strikes in Ukrainian port of Odessa after just saying that he sees this as a beacon of hope. So now what's going on? I think what's going on is if you remember the Aesop's fable, I think it was, of the scorpion and the frog. Let's see, was it Aesop? A scorpion wants to cross a river, but he cannot swim, so he asks a frog to carry it across. The frog hesitates, afraid that the scorpion might sting it. But the scorpion promises not to, pointing out that it would drown if it killed the frog in the middle of the river. So they swim across the river, right? And then the scorpion stings the frog, and they both drown. And as they're starting to drown, the dying frog asks the scorpion why it stung, despite knowing the consequence, to which the scorpion replies, I'm sorry, but I couldn't resist the urge. It's just my nature. And I think that's kind of what's going on here. It's just the Russians, it doesn't matter what's written on paper. They're going to continue to do this, and that's why they need to be stopped. Okay, let's turn to political news here. Orban calls for the U.S. Russia talks on Ukraine war, says Kyiv can't win. Now, again, Prime Minister Orban, he is one of Russia's closest allies in the West. I mean, he and maybe the Serbian leader are two of the closest. Hungarian Prime Minister Orban's called for United States and Russia to hold peace talks to end the war, and they'll start doing this more and more as Russia holds ground, and they hold 18% of the land beyond the 5% or so that is Crimea. So they own about a quarter of Ukrainian ground right now, and then as they solidify that, they're going to call for peace talks, and then say, "See, Ukraine, they're the aggressor." Okay, only U.S. Russian talk or Russian U.S. talks can put an end to the conflict because Russia wants security guarantees, he says. He says EU sanctions will not change the course of the war and that Ukrainians will not come out victorious. He said, pointing to the Russians' military asymmetrical dominance. They have dominance, but they have nukes, but they can't use the nukes. Oh, they'll be a pariah throughout the entire world, and they know that. It's like the U.S. having nukes, but they had a hard time with Afghanistan. Why? You can't use the nukes. You just can't. So that's kind of what's going on. Hungary is among European nations most dependent on Russian natural gas. 85% of its needs come from the Kremlin. So that might be part of what's going on. But he also is very sympathetic toward Putin. Okay, other news. Ukraine urges citizens to reveal Russian troop locations. Thought this was really interesting as well. Ukraine Defense Ministry has urged citizens of key areas seized by Russia to reveal where Moscow's troops were living and who among the local population was collaborating. They're talking about the southern city of Endahar, which is a home to a nuclear power station. They're saying the Ukrainian administration saying, please let us know as a matter of urgency the exact location of the occupying troops, bases, and their residential addresses and the places of residence of commanding staff. It said, adding that exact coordinates were desirable. So you know what would happen with exact coordinates. There's a couple other interesting things. Like there's one about, and I'm going to finish with this one about Zielinski's security. But there's some other interesting news about like oligarchs and how this works, how the war has robbed Ukraine's oligarchs of political influence. Ukraine's richest people are known as oligarchs. These are people who, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, got these sweetheart deals in order to, buy up businesses at 10 cents on the dollar, and then they kind of run things now. It's not just in Ukraine. It's a corrupt system, but it's in Ukraine, it's in Russia, it's in a lot of former failed Soviet states. Okay, so Ukraine's richest people, known as the country's oligarchs, are used to dominating political and economic life, but they've gotten really quiet. Experts attribute this loss of influence to them trying to shore up their business. They need the protection in the form of the military and diplomacy, but they're not necessarily getting it, and they're trying to keep the businesses afloat. Matkea Porteyev, an MP, said the oligarchs are in an unusual position of not being able to influence at the moment. So will that continue later on? Unlike in 2014, when Ukrainian oligarch Igor Kolominsky, for instance, was involved in defending the Dnipro region, there is someone to do that now, the state. Okay, so by the way, Kaminsky, there's a really interesting story about him. He just lost his Ukraine. Now, this guy, Kaminsky, he just lost his Ukrainian visa. He's been outlawed as a Ukrainian citizen. The notorious oligarch Ihor Kolminsky and controversial politicians pro-Russian Vladimir Rabinovich and Igor Korobin are included in a list of 10 people who have been deprived of their Ukrainian citizenship by presidential decree. Now, this is absolutely fascinating because Zielinski is often tied to Kaminsky as being somebody who had funded his TV and his TV production company and things along those lines. So he's tied to, like, well, he's just in the pocket of this oligarch, and apparently he's not. He's lost his Ukrainian citizenship. Potentially, this is another major development in the week where Zielinski has dismissed the general procurator, the head of the state security service, and a number of other regional officials. So that's what's going on there. Okay, back to the story about oligarchs. Right now, the priority for oligarchs is not politics, but making sure they're minimizing their business losses. Under the law, now there's a law that was passed. Ukrainian politicians have historically become, now it's reasonably corrupt in Ukraine, like even before the war, right? A carousel of intrigue, infighting, and corrupt backroom deals. And it's similar in Russia. So the whole region kind of has this kind of shady dealing. Look at Transparency International, look at Heritage Index, and you'll see that there's some corruption there. We all know that. Zelensky actually came in as arguing that he wanted to clean up corruption, and he's taken some steps toward that. Not as far as we would have liked, but he was taking steps toward that. In September 2021, Zielinski passed a de-oligarchization law that, among other things, created a register of oligarchs. Under the law, oligarchs are defined as people who meet any of 3 or 4 characteristics: participation in political life. So if you're not at all involved in politics, you're not on this. Significant influence on the media. If you don't have that, you're not one. owner of a monopoly or owner of assets worth more than 1 million times the Ukrainian living wage. Renat Akhmetov, who rejected the label oligarch, handed over his media empire last week when the law came into effect. Now, it might be because they're having cash flow problems from the war, but nonetheless, Ukraine's oligarchs have made statements in general. I mean, almost all of them have said things anti, like this thing in Russia invading, it's a bad thing. This are Ukrainian oligarchs now, not Russian. And there were some Russian oligarchs that were complaining about this as they're being sanctioned as well. But most of them have been saying things anti-Russia. But now it's interesting to think, like, what will happen after the war? Will they come back or will they not? Um, this article also ended with this really interesting thing. Ukraine's MPs, members of parliament, and faction leaders appear to have come to some sort of informal agreement to present a unified front during the war. Otherwise, they'd be kind of at each other, right? Ukraine's MPs have been voting, sometimes almost unanimously, to pass pieces of legislation, including big sticking points such as the Istanbul Convention on Domestic Abuse. It has been marked by a change to before the war, when Ukrainian parliamentary sessions were famous for brawls and fistfights. Now, you don't want to go to brawls and fistfights, but if you're all agreeing on something, something's not right. Like, you don't have true democracy. Like look at America or the British. I love the British Parliament. I love watching them kind of chastise each other. But look at how rancorous it is. Now, you don't want fistfights, but you do want disagreements and the ability to freely speak and think through these things. The most terrifying time that I can remember in U.S. history was when you saw all the congressmen all singing God Bless America on the Capitol steps. Why? It was 9/11. They had to lock arm in arm. They weren't at each other. They had a unified front because they had to have a unified front. And that's how this works. So having a unified front isn't necessarily a good thing. And it's hard to kind of wrap your mind around. You want to have not division, but you want to have different sides expressing their opinions and letting the best solution rise to the top. Now, the article ended with this. If Ukraine wins the war by dealing a decisive military blow to Russia, then Zielinski's popularity will remain high. He's at 93%. He was at 25% before the war. If Zielinski is forced to agree with the ceasefire compromise, for example, to shore up the rest of the country, then it will divide society and an opposition will appear. Well, an opposition is going to reappear anyway in time. Just give it time, because that's the way that democracies actually work. Okay, last article I want to talk to, and it's this. It's an RT. The U.S. is concerned about Zielinski's safety. Well, yeah, we've been concerned about his safety because, I mean, he actually unified Ukraine, and he was the glue that held the country together in the early days of the war. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said on Friday that Washington's worried about the personal safety of Ukrainian President Vladimir Zielinski. Quote, President Zielinski's personal safety is something that concerns us, Sullivan told the Aspen Security Forum in Colorado. This is a leader in wartime dealing with an enemy in Russia that is about as ruthless, brutal, and capable of just about anything. As you saw when the Scorpion decided 12 hours after the initial contract between Ukraine, Russia, Turkey, and the United Nations not to interfere with grain shipments, that they're sending cruise missiles against Odessa. 12 hours. Okay, because they're Scorpions. Okay, adding that the U.S. is helping to facilitate the Ukrainian leader's security without elaborating. Good not to elaborate, just make sure you do it. Okay, the U.S. offered to evacuate Zielinski from Kyiv when Russia launched its military operation in Ukraine in February. Zielinski did not take the offer. That's where he said, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. Wow, that was leadership, and it was on display before the entire world when we thought, oh no, you just signed your own death sentence. Now, Ukraine's president has claimed on several occasions that assassins have threatened his life, and they have, and it's documented. And his officials said numerous times that Russia intends to have the president killed. They have. Moscow denies these allegations. Of course they do, because they lied. They're Scorpions. This is what they do. With the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, stating on April that Zielinski, quote, is the president of Ukraine, and Russia wants him to sit down and agree to its terms for peace. Huh? No, they've tried to kill him. So, okay, you can't believe them because they're scorpions. And that's really the moral of the story today. It's just you can't trust the agreement because you just can't trust them because they're scorpions. I mean, if this is what they're going to do, so you just have to deal with them where they are. Now, Zielinski also said something that I thought was really interesting about a month ago. He said that you know, if these paper parchments don't work, this has to be won on the battlefield. I mean, if your agreements don't work, including, think about this, including the Bucharest memorandum, which was the United States, the UK in 1994, I believe. The United States, UK, and Russia all agreed that they would defend the sovereignty of the state of Ukraine as long as they gave up their nukes. They did, they signed, everybody agreed, and it was Russia who was the invader who came in 2014 and has been there ever since and gobbled up 5% of the land then and another 18% of the land now. So that's the story. And I think it's a pretty fair analogy that Russia's acting like that scorpion to Ukraine as a frog. Hey, thank you for taking the time to listen to me. Come back again tomorrow on day 151.